Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the green space today. And when we are in the green space, you can watch as well as listen. We're streaming live video at WNYC.org or on the WNYC Facebook page. Now we continue a conversation that we've been having on the show about electability in the context of the presidential race and how, especially in the absence of concrete evidence, our prejudices can take root when determining who can or cannot win, in our opinions. With 21 candidates, including 6 women, 2 African Americans, a Samoan American, and a Taiwanese American, people's assumptions about electability are being interrogated like never before. So let's interrogate 2 more aspects of electability or perceived electability with 2 guests who have published articles in the Times in the last few days. One aspect is likability. The other is so-called internet ability, going viral on social media. My guests are Claire Bond-Potter, professor of history at the New School, and Vice News correspondent Jay Caspian Kang. But your article was in the Times, right?
Yeah, I'm just at the Times now.
Oh, you're just at the Times. Sorry. So thanks for coming in. Thanks for coming to the Green Space. Claire, you try in your piece to trace the history of likability as a concept in American politics. So how far back did your research take you?
Oh, it took me way far back. So when I first thought of the idea, I thought, oh, it must be 2009 when we're all liking things on Facebook, right? But the more I dug into it, the more it sort of propelled me back into the 19th century, where men liking each other was sort of a synonym for trusting each other, and liking others and being liked became really important. And that sort of propels itself into the advice literature of marketing and advertising. And so where likability enters politics precisely is in 1952 with the Eisenhower campaign, the slogan of which was, "I like Ike," with an Irving Berlin jingle and so on and so forth. So likability becomes sort of embedded in politics at a moment when politicians are going on television and large media campaigns by advertising agencies are being mounted on their behalf.
Jay, your piece is titled "Pete Buttigieg's Meaningless Erudition Made Him the Smart Candidate." So
Sure.
What does smart mean and what does meaningless mean in this context?
Well, meaningless, I think, meant that a lot of the things that I was seeing, both on social media, but also from my colleagues in the media itself, and especially within opinion columnists, was this idea that the sort of resume that Pete Buttigieg had put together, which is impressive. He went to Harvard, he was a Rhodes Scholar, and he allegedly spoke 7 or 8 languages. Like that somehow was a stand-in for him being really a great presidential candidate. And the thing that bothered me about it wasn't that people were sort of fawning over, sort of like an Ivy League guy. It was more that the other candidates seemed to have the exact same. Like maybe they didn't speak 7 languages, but as we found in the article, like Pete Buttigieg doesn't really either. He says he can order a sandwich in 7 languages in his book. And so that sort of drift from, people who have almost the same, like almost everyone running is an Ivy Leaguer. Almost everyone running has like an impressive past. Why was it that a 37-year-old mayor from South Bend, Indiana was being touted as being so much smarter than somebody like Elizabeth Warren, who has, a much more blue-collar background, who really sort of, was a policy expert for decades? Like, why did that happen? So that was the question that I tried to answer.
And you point out how some of the media are gushing over Buttigieg, like Ryan Lizza of Esquire asked him if running for president was more like Ulysses or more like Finnegan's Wake. See, audience, backstory. I told the audience before the show that Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses would come up.
Yeah, that was, I just remember, there was like a whole day where I felt like there was a fissure amongst the media, and some people were being like, this is great, like he can speak coherently about Ulysses, and the other half were like, well, what does this have to do with anything, And I fell on one side, but like I just, that was, and then there's several articles about like his favorite books, and these are sort of being passed around as being evidence, and just like, look, the rest of them also can read, they also have favorite books. And why is it better for one's favorite book to be Ulysses or like a Norwegian novel and not like, like some work of history that informs their policies? Like, like this answer just never materialized for me, so I was frustrated by that.
And listeners, I also told the audience before the show that Moby Dick would come up as well, but that's not going to be until Andy Borowitz comes on later. So you'll just have to wait for it. Claire, how do you see likability as a gendered trait, which your article asserts that it is, in the way that it's used or in public perception or in its origins?
Well, likability was created by men for men. And so for women to fit into likability, it's really a tough sell. I mean, I think, thinking about what Brian said about how Pete Buttigieg's intellectual abilities are being touted, what do we have to say about Elizabeth Warren? She's a wonky professor, right? And so there is this way in which qualities that are considered very likable in men are considered unlikable in women. And one of the points I make in the article is that we actually don't fantasize about women as strong leaders or tough negotiators or thoughtful policymakers. But when we hear that a man has the intelligence to, maybe negotiate a treaty with North Korea, then we are all in. Or, that he reads Finnegan's Wake. Nobody reads Finnegan's Wake. I just want to say that, okay?
Yeah.
But
and I can confirm that I took a raise hands poll of the Green Space audience before and nobody had read.
None of you did.
They hadn't read the Mueller report either, but they didn't read Finnegan's Wake.
I read the Mueller report, but I'm a wonk, so.
Some of them did read Moby Dick, though. Over and over, we heard that Hillary Clinton wasn't likable. Here's a famous cringeworthy clip from a 2008 Clinton-Obama debate.
Those of you on this stage, you are the most experienced and the most electable. What can you say to the voters of New Hampshire on this stage tonight who see your resume and like it, but are hesitating on the likability issue, where they seem to like Barack Obama more?
Well, that hurts my feelings.
I'm sorry, Senator. I'm sorry.
But I'll try to go on. He's very likable. I agree with that. I don't think I'm that bad.
You're likable enough.
Thank you so much.
Cringe. People are cringing all over again in the Green Space audience. Listeners, you couldn't see it. Claire Bon Potter, deconstruct that moment in the context of your article.
Well, of course, one of the things people said immediately after that happened was that it reflected very badly on Obama, and it was like being transported back to high school where the prom king was going after the woman who gets elected treasurer of the class because nobody else wants it. And I think, what is interesting about that is that Hillary herself had brought up the question of likability. In fact, before she launched her presidential campaign, she launched something called a Likability tour, which was similar to the listening tour that she had launched before her Senate campaign. But that was because the people who were handling her knew that she had likability problems. One of the things I would suggest is that Hillary's approval ratings were highest when her husband was treating her most badly. And that once she actually began to have her own accomplishments, her likability began to slide precipitously. And so one theory I would put out there is it's easy to like women when they are in the position of being injured, right? And that clip is a perfect example of it. Hillary actually won that primary, and there are many people that attribute that moment to her victory. But it's much more difficult to like women when they start having accomplishments and when they start getting out there competing with men for the kinds of things that men are supposed to do.
You reference, as you said before, not only the political history, but the sort of business and self-help history. You mentioned in your article the classic 1936 book, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Was he writing about likability per se? Did he use that word?
He used the word like a lot. And it was interesting, two of the texts, the other one was Horatio Alger. I went to the Google Books and just put like in, and it came up something like 230 times for Ragged Dick. I put it in for Dale Carnegie, and it came up over 100 times. So the idea of liking was being touted as this crucial connection between people that not only made businesses work, but made careers happen. What's interesting, of course, is Carnegie says you can easily, by trying too hard to make people like you, they start to dislike you. And the examples he gives of that are women. There's a woman named Henrietta G., who was one of the most productive people in her office, but she bragged about her accomplishments. And as I thought later, well, if she had been Henry G., would people have actually liked her for her accomplishments?
I wonder, Jay, if you have thought, since you wrote about Buttigieg and, what they call internet-y intelligence, or did you coin that phrase? Did people say?
A friend of mine said it, yeah.
Yeah, internet-y intelligence. And you referred before to things that some candidates do online more than others, getting a lot of likes on Facebook or elsewhere. Have you thought about whether like on the internet in 2019 means the same thing as like the way Dale Carnegie might have used it in 1936?
Well, I think the gendered components of it are still pretty striking. I always think about like why Elizabeth Warren is running the campaign she's running, where she seems to put out a policy paper every Monday, and where she's just like, I have a plan for that. And I think that in some ways it's a response to what you were talking about with the Hillary campaign, where she is trying to figure out a way where she can minimize her personality. And it might not, I don't think it's because Elizabeth Warren is an unlikable person or that she thinks or anyone in her campaign thinks that way. But she doesn't think, and I think she is correct about this, that she can do what Pete Buttigieg does and just sort of go out and sprinkle, well, I did this, I was in Malta and I did this, I cooked there's an article in the New Yorker, Talk of the Town this week, that, was sort of saying that Pete Buttigieg was great because when he was reading Ulysses, he cooked liver in his kitchen, because that's what they do in the book. And I was just like, well, a lot of people did that. People eat cucumber sandwiches all the time because of that book. What's the deal with that? And I don't think that Elizabeth Warren could run a campaign like that. And I think that in that way, it's very similar.
Does AOC maybe represent the other end of this phenomenon? Like she's the internet candidate who does things like that for black and brown and female voices that haven't been heard?
Yes, and I think that shows sort of the two sides of it, right? Like one is where you have your own crowd, you have your own audience, and you have fans. I think AOC is one of the rare politicians who really has fans. But I think still with presidential campaigns, they're filtered through the mainstream media, through cable news, through everything like that. And I think when that happens, there's still those concerns. Like I still think that filtering always goes one way.
Listeners, if you're just joining us, we have Jay Caspian Kang from the New York Times Magazine, who wrote the piece, How Pete Buttigieg's Meaningless Erudition Made Him the, quote, smart candidate, and Claire Bond Potter, who's a history professor at the New School and had a New York Times op-ed the other day, Men Invented Likability, Guess Who Benefits? And we can take a few phone calls before we run out of time, or questions from the audience here in the green space. Raise your hand and we'll come around. I see a few hands are up already. Or on the phones, it's 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. Let's take a green space question right now. Hi.
Hi, I'm Jerry. How are you?
Good. We're all great.
How do you put this likability in the context of Donald Trump getting elected? Because even people I know who voted for him, unfortunately I do know some, don't like him. Nobody likes him. They think he's dishonest.
Actually, that's not true that people don't like him. And I discovered this in a very difficult way, which was sitting in an AT&T store in Northampton, Massachusetts, where you think you'd be safe. And I said...
That's like Hampshire College territory,
right.
UMass.
And I said, nobody likes Donald Trump. And a blue-collar guy sitting next to me with his son, I thought he was going to start crying, and he said, that's not true. I like Donald Trump a lot. And I think it says something about how our filter bubbles operate, that often people who don't like Donald Trump, whether they voted for him or not, are not in his spaces. I went to CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference last year, where Trump spoke. And all you have to do is hang out in the line at the women's bathroom after a Trump speech, and you will learn how much Trump's base really likes him. And he likes them too. I mean, the dynamic, and he'll just say, I love you, and they scream, I love you too. It's an extraordinary thing to watch. But I would also like to say, liking someone does not make someone likable. Likable is a term that's made in the media. Right? So a lot of people responded to my piece about Hillary Clinton saying, it's not true that she's not likable. I like her. Well, good for you. But actually, I think some of the stuff that Jay is talking about how things zip around the internet, the preponderance of what is said on the internet, regardless of whether you like her or not. And I've met Hillary. I think she's great. But she's unlikable in the media. And that sticks to her like gum on her shoe.
Another question here. Hi.
Good morning. So my question is, how is it that an ultra-Islamic nation like Indonesia, a macho nation like Germany, and a macho nation like Britain can have Margaret Thatcher, Angela Merkel, and an Islamic woman running as a prime minister, and yet that makes us as Americans really backwards because we can't put a woman in the top office?
Claire, you want to take that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I would answer it in two ways. One is American democracy at this point is so framed by partisanship, far beyond the way it is in other countries. Other countries run their elections very, very differently, and they form coalition governments, and there are multiple parties, and so on. So it's actually easier to form coalitions around ideas rather than personalities in other countries. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing to think about is that many other countries actually have written into their constitutions certain kinds of representation. So there are European countries that actually have said, you have to have 50% women, you know? So there is a kind of structured effort to eliminate gender discrimination in the election process, even though it may not always look that way in the media.
We might even have an answer to this question or a take on this question from a caller. So we're going to go to line 3. Beata in Red Bank. You're on WNYC. Hello, Beata.
Hello.
Hi there.
Yeah, I just want to let you know that, you probably already know that, of course, that in Northern Europe, being likable is kind of considered to be nice, which means it's sort of like a vapid attitude, and it does not really portray character. And character and authenticity, and I'm not talking about the Trump authenticity, but real authenticity is much higher valued than being likable is kind of like, ugh, what else is new? So it would never even become an issue.
Thank you very much. Claire, because you were doing a cross-cultural comparison before, does that ring true to you?
It absolutely rings true. There was a great article in the New Yorker a couple of years ago about Angela Merkel that talked about how important it was that she grew up in East Germany, and how that created a sort of authenticity for her at a moment where integrating the East German economy, but more importantly, the East German worker, into a greater Germany was really the primary issue. And so seeing Merkel as somebody who understood that problem, but also had the personality to bridge the cultural gap between East and West became extremely important. And I think character is really the key word here.
We have a question for Jay from Andrew in Brooklyn on line 2. Andrew, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Yes, hello. I just wanted to round out my appreciation for Pete Buttigieg's literary choices and erudition is partly because he's very well-rounded. When you think about his military service and how we're all sort of New York hip, and he's like from South Bend, Indiana, and yet he's still so cool and learned and all this stuff. So I don't necessarily know if it's that he's got a leg up. I think it's just more interesting than a Harvard professor like Elizabeth Warren being erudite. You know what I mean?
Thank you. So, Jay, what about that? If you're assessing Buttigieg, and I realize your article is about a concept,
Yeah.
and about how the media works and how public perceptions work, but it sort of targets Buttigieg as the example of that in a negative way, and maybe as the caller is raising, the fact that he was also a military guy rounds him out in a different, unique kind of way.
Sure, and I think that his military service is important. I think it's also symbolically important that he is the first gay presidential candidate running for the Democratic Party. I think those things are important. I think that they matter to his candidacy. I don't know if comparing a Harvard professor to him and saying that he's more well-rounded really makes sense, though. And that's another thing that I objected to, which was just that, like, if you look at the other candidates, some of them also speak other languages, and I was always wondering why Buttigieg gets attributed to intellectual curiosity. That's the phrase I kept hearing over and over again. Oh, he's intellectually curious. And I was like, well, what does that really mean? It's just like, oh, well, he speaks Norwegian instead of Mandarin, which is what Kristen Gillibrand speaks somewhat. Like with Kristen Gillibrand, I think that the response was like, oh, she was just learning Mandarin because it's useful, But with Pete Buttigieg, I think that, oh, well, Norwegian, what a useless language to learn. It must be because he's so intellectually curious and his brain is so capacious that he can just be like, oh, I have this interest. And I was like, look, even if I grant that all that is true, which I wouldn't, because I don't think that is a good standard to say, even if all that is true, then why does that translate to the office of the presidency? He's the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, which is a town of 100,000 people, and it's a very nice campus town. I went there last year. With some problems that he's addressed in some ways and hasn't in other ways. But I just like this idea of well-roundedness and intellectual curiosity. I also think, I think what it comes down to is that a lot of the people. I grew up very similar to Pete Buttigieg. I grew up in a college town and similar schooling, and I think that the people who do that oftentimes end up in the media. And when they look for somebody that they want to like, they see somebody who's a little bit like them, and that's where they're like, well, I'm intellectually curious, so he must be also intellectually curious.
We almost, I almost cited a tweet by Chris Hayes, the MSNBC host, in our previous segment when we were talking about de Blasio maybe running for president. Chris Hayes had tweeted regarding de Blasio, I get all the eye rolling, I do, but it's also a little odd that a guy who's run the biggest city in America creditably is perceived as a joke, but the mayor of South Bend is the next big thing.
Yeah.
Well, that's because Chris Hayes has actually never been to South Bend, I think. South Bend was the first place I learned that Donald Trump was going to be president, and that was March 2016, when the driver who was bringing me from Chicago to Notre Dame said, absolutely, Donald Trump is going to be president, and I almost jumped out of the car. I was so shocked. But South Bend has actually undergone an enormous economic transformation, and the kind of transformation that New York has not undergone under de Blasio. And this is what happens, actually, when we get into personalities and move away from policies, right? We want Pete Buttigieg to be the next Obama. We want to like him in all the ways we learned to like Obama. But in fact, Pete Buttigieg has navigated elections in an enormously partisan electorate. The same people who elected Mike Pence elected Pete Buttigieg. That's something to pause on. But also, South Bend has become a center for the arts. They're encouraging people to stay there after they've gone to school there. There's been huge development downtown, and at a moment when artists and writers and young people can't get a foothold in New York, people are moving to South Bend because there are tech opportunities and they can have studios for their art. So that's the problem. When we start talking about Ulysses, we're not actually talking about the economic transformations this guy has been in charge of.
And to circle this back around to likability and gender a little bit, when we were talking about him learning Norwegian just out of curiosity as a positive thing, and Kirsten Gillibrand learning it because it's useful as a negative thing, it could even go beyond that, Claire, that with Gillibrand, it's seen as striving in a way that she gets judged for.
Right. Kirsten Gillibrand is cursed. I mean, the fact that she actually announced her presidential bid on the day that the Mueller report was released, I just thought, this is the bad luck girl. I mean, it can't get any worse. But I would also say Kirsten Gillibrand has suffered from the fact that she was the first person who said Al Franken has to go. If Al Franken has done these things, he has to go. And for me, that is, just really, nobody liked her because she said what everybody knew, and now everybody's blaming it on her. And however you feel about Al Franken and what he did, it was consistent with Gillibrand's policy aims, which has been to fight sexual violence and to work on behalf of rape survivors and to make sure sexual harassment laws in the military are being enforced. It would have been inconsistent for her to say, oh, let's just give Al Franken a pass, right?
This is WNYC FM HD and AM New York, WNJT FM 88.1 Trenton, WNJP 88.5 Sussex, WNJY 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO 90.3 Toms River. We are New York and New Jersey Public Radio. We're almost done with our current guests, history professor from the New School, Claire Bond-Potter, who has a New York Times op-ed called Men Invented Likability, Guess Who Benefits, and New York Times writer Jay Caspian Kang, who has a magazine piece, how Pete Buttigieg's meaningless erudition made him the, quote, smart candidate. And I just want to take one more phone call from Dave in Westchester on line 3, who has a theory about all of this, I think. Dave, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi. Thank you for taking my call. This comes from a failed New Yorker cartoon that was rejected, so full disclosure. I'm a writer and cartoonist, and long time ago, way before Trump ran for president, I came up with this theory about why we pick a president. And it goes back to the patriarchy, the father of our country, and I theorize that the pop culture or the prime electorate chooses a president based on their ideal of patriarchal leader. Okay, so I'm going to say, for instance, we'll start with Jimmy Carter. The prime electorate that voted for Jimmy Carter were children who sat in front of the television set and watched the Andy Griffith Show. Jimmy Carter was our Andy Griffith president. He was the sheriff who kept his bullets and his gun somewhere else. And
what is Donald Trump? What is Donald Trump through this lens?
Okay, well let's
because we don't have time, so I have to.
Okay, a president has a pop culture doppelganger.
That suits
Trump
the times.
Is our Sopranos mafia porn type president. Every time I talk to a Trump supporter, I always kind of get around to like, hey, are you a Sopranos fan? Almost always a Sopranos fan, or can quote Goodfellas.
Hard to find anybody who isn't a Sopranos. But Dave, thank you for calling. I'm going to move on. Sorry, because we're really out of time for the segment. But I'll let our guests have one quick go at this. Anything about electing the president who sort of fits our pop culture narratives at the time?
Oh, yeah, sure. I think that's very powerful, especially now. And I think that so much of politics has been ceded to pop culture anyway that I don't know if, maybe Tony Soprano isn't the right one.
Doesn't even
Trump.
have to be Tony Soprano.
Yeah.
It can be Trump for Trump. It can be The Apprentice Trump.
Sure,
For
yes.
a lot of
I think
people,
Trump
it actually is, literally.
I think Trump is I think it's the person they saw on television. And maybe if they're a little bit older, or at least, as old as I am, the person who, they grew up with as being like the coolest rich guy ever and who had like a board game and everything like that. So I think that is true. And I think, just with the candidates right now, I think that people are trying to vote for the aspirational version of themselves, or a lot of people are doing that. And, I think that is a lot of the Buttigieg electorate, which is, they see him as the best case scenario for like what a liberal arts education can produce. which he might be.
Or they see him as Mr. Rogers.
Sure.
Yeah.
Claire, last
So, there's a media studies professor somewhere writing a book about what Dave just said, I'm sure. But I think the real problem is we don't see the president in the body of a woman, which is part of what Dave is talking about. And I think one of the things Elizabeth Warren is doing, which is very powerful, which she's been doing since she ran to be the first woman senator from Massachusetts, is she gets down on her knees in front of a little girl and says, "Hi, I'm Elizabeth Warren. I'm running for president because that's what girls do." And it's incredibly powerful. And it's that kind of transformation that we need. You need to be able to look at a woman and see a leader, see a president.
Please thank Claire Bond Potter and Jay Caspian Kang. Thank you both so much for a great conversation. Great to have both of you here on the Green Space stage.